There are important milestones in the life of a project car. The day you bring it home, the day you get the motor running, the day one of your neighbors calls in a code violation for your derelict car. One of those important days is the rolling chassis. That's today for me. A rolling chassis is a car without the bodywork that can roll, meaning it has the wheels and suspension and it's all tied together with a frame. Sort of like a really unsafe soapbox derby car. Some people differ on this definition, like Wikipedia, which says the car has to be able to move under its own power, which is absurd. That's a running chassis, not a rolling chassis. GM will sell you a rolling chassis Camaro that has the entire suspension and the body, but no powertrain. This makes sense. The Camaro is a unibody car, so you kind of need the body to connect that all together. Anyway, somebody go edit Wikipedia while I talk about this rolling chassis right here. What we're really talking about here today is the front suspension. The rear suspension is all taken directly from the Tesla Model 3, except for the springs and dampers. I used coilovers because it was just way easier to package them. The frame that connects it all together we talked about a few weeks ago, so to round out the rolling chassis, we really just need the front suspension. I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that I was planning on using Mustang II suspension. This is super common in the hot rodding community, so common that there is a gigantic aftermarket for the Mustang II parts. I wanted to tap into this aftermarket for 3 reasons. 1, it's gigantic. There are all sorts of parts and systems available at all sorts of costs and quality. 2, I know that geometry works decently well, and I don't really want to design a suspension from the ground up. Suspension design is one of those things that's great if you really want to geek out into it, but it's kind of maddening if you just want it to work. Change one thing and it will affect everything else. Shorten your control arms and you've changed your roll center, your camber gain, your Ackerman, and now you have bump steer. The third reason I wanted to use this suspension is that it's fairly similar to the suspension that came with the Jaguar. This will allow me to use the existing shock towers and the control arm mounting points. The original Jaguar suspension is actually a pretty great design. I didn't reuse it because I didn't trust the strength of it given its age. Also, the upper control arm was way shorter than the lower, so it ended up with tons of camber gain when you go around a corner. This is probably a good design on those old round tires, but not so much on the newer, fatter rubber. There are some issues with using the Mustang II suspension. It's not really made for a car this heavy. Also, it's a little sloppy and pretty old. But I'm not using suspension from a 45-year-old compact Ford. I'm using parts from the gigantic aftermarket. There are no Ford parts on this suspension. It's all made by RideTech, Willwood, and me. In fact, I'm not going to call it a Mustang II suspension anymore. I'm going to call it a Mustang Jag suspension. I'm going to have to work on that name. Anyway, the idea was that I could buy all these aftermarket parts, bolt them onto the car, and I wouldn't have to change anything. If you've been following this build, you've probably figured out by now that by the time all of the parts came in, I had changed everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of things. The first thing I ordered was the brake system, which is good because it was back-ordered for several weeks. Willwood has a great spindle for the Mustang II geometry, the Mustang Jagometry. It's a one-piece forged steel spindle with a removable steering arm. I got that and some pretty shiny red calipers around 12-inch rotors. 12-inch seemed adequate and will allow me to put 15-inch steel wheels on here should I choose to do so. The lower control arms are strong arms from RideTech. These things are beefy, real strong, also real expensive. I had to modify these slightly. I'm trying to reuse the Jaguar shock towers, which is a little bit rearward from where the shock towers are supposed to mount. The lower shock mount goes between these 2 bars here. I welded on a collar so that I could move it to this side between this bar and this collar. Then I just added a sleeve between the 2 bars and I ran a really long bolt all the way through. After that, I painted that up and I was done with the lower control arm. No more changes there. Totally done. To attach the lower control arm to the frame, I needed some sort of pivot axis. I designed a steel piece that held a tube in the right location. I had all these pieces waterjet back when I had the frame modification parts waterjet. There are some slots in here, so this will slide in and out for a bit of adjustment. I reused a couple of the bolt holes that were originally used for the Jaguar lower control arm mounts. I also added a couple for safety. These worked great without any modification, until I put them on the car and realized that my lower control arm articulated right into this corner. So they came off and I sanded down that corner. I still need to drill a new mounting hole to move this bolt. I added washers on the side so that I could slide the lower control arm forward or backward, more adjustment, and it was interfering with the mount in its most forward position, so I fixed that. These things are pretty heavily built, so I didn't worry too much about cutting out this metal. The upper control arms didn't play so nice with the mounting. The inboard axis was going right through this flange. I needed to move it in or out. Out would have made mounting a lot easier. In fact, it would have been almost the exact same mount as the Jaguar originally had. I didn't want to do this because a shorter upper control arm would cause things to change a lot more as the suspension moves. As we already discussed, the original Jaguar suspension had a very short upper control arm. Too much camber change, so I made the control arm longer. This was only one of two notable changes in suspension geometry. Neither were very significant. Since there was all this metal in the way, I couldn't just use a long tube with some metal welded to it like I did with the lower control arms, but that's fine. I decided to just bolt some blocks of aluminum between these two flanges here. That way I can drill and tap holes wherever I want the pivot to be. This allowed me to do the other small change in geometry. I added some anti-dive, just a smidge. This will help keep the car from feeling like a pig under braking. These blocks also make it really easy to change the geometry in the future. This is a good thing because I didn't actually do any kinematic analysis when I added that anti-dive, so it's entirely possible that I just fucked everything up. Anyway, all these changes meant that I had to redesign and custom build upper control arms. Control arms are pretty straightforward, and I think I might do a video on how to design and build them in the future, but here's the basic idea. The two inner pivots are threaded rod ends. These are great because you can get them in whatever size and strength you need, and they're adjustable. I can thread the rod end in and out to lengthen or shorten the control arm so I can change camber. I can also lengthen one and shorten the other to change caster. I know this will change the geometry, which I specifically said I don't want to do, but a little bit of adjustment is always good. The stock caster on the suspension is pretty minimal, and I prefer to have a little more snap back to center in my steering. The outer ball joint is just the Moog joint that everybody uses for this type of suspension. Weirdly, it came from a Chrysler. It was about this time that I thought it might be cool to use air suspension on this car. I've never been much into air suspension, but I think it might be pretty cool on this car. So I checked a few air suspension setups and I designed the upper control arm for a little more clearance. This meant that the A-arm was less of an A shape and more of a D shape. This is not ideal because the load path is not direct. The arm wants to bend whenever you go into a corner. This is a less efficient design, but it's not a deal breaker. I went with a wall thickness of 1/8 of an inch. To get this bend, I just bought a couple of drive shaft loops that were already bent. I lasered the pattern on some wood, cut everything to size, and welded it all together. I added a bit of reinforcement at this weld over here to get more strength. Then I was done with the upper control arms. Later, I realized I didn't like this joint here. It seemed weak, so I took the control arms off, sanded the paint off, and welded in a reinforcement. Then I was done with the upper control arms. But then I decided I didn't really like this connection here. It's probably fine, but I went ahead and welded a sleeve over it. Totally done with the upper control arms. And then my air suspension came in, and that just fucked everything up. The biggest interference came with this part of the existing Jaguar shock tower. That was a pretty easy fix, using a tool that I like to call the Chief Engineer. But the inflated bags were still too big. This meant I would either need to relocate the upper mount or relocate the lower mount. I already relocated the lower mount once on the lower control arm, so why not do it again? Why do something once when you can do it 3 times? The shock was originally intended to be mounted here, but then I added that collar so I could mount it here. But this time I drilled new holes to move it back between the original bars, but farther outboard. With the mount moved outboard, I needed to get some high misalignment bearing adapters, which are just little extensions that allow the bearing to move a little bit more than it normally does. These, of course, did not fit, so I had to break out the lathe and make them fit. I also needed to make some minor adjustments to the shock, slightly voiding my warranty. After that, I noticed my added reinforcements for the upper control arms were interfering, so I had to pull those off and modify those. I also managed to get a bump stop in the same location as the original Jaguar bump stop. I got some load-rated bumpers and screwed them in to the old location with a couple washers to get them at the right height. Then it was time to make an actual rolling chassis. I added the wheels and lowered the car onto its suspension, except that I needed to move it away from the body to get the left front wheel on, but the parking brakes were engaged, so I couldn't slide it. If only I had something that allowed me to move the... Oh wait, there's that thing I invented. Once it was on the ground, I put some air in the front suspension so that it wasn't resting on the bump stops, and voila, rolling chassis. After that, I was done and there were no more modifications to be made. Well, maybe one. Two, actually. I'm going to get rid of the old spindle and I'm going to build a new upright so that I can use the Tesla hub bearings, but we're going to talk about that at another time, mostly because I haven't made it yet. Also, it's kind of an unnecessary upgrade. Everything works the way it is. The suspension that I chose so that I didn't have to customize it and then proceeded to change everything. With all these changes, I really need a new name. It's pretty far from Mustang II. It's kind of a neutral geometry, and I'm going to be using parts from Tesla and the aftermarket, and it's mine, so we'll just call it the matte using suspension from Tesla and aftermarket with neutral geometry. And since so much has changed that it really is the second iteration, we'll add a 2 at the end. Then we can shorten it up by taking the first letters, and we'll call it the Mustang II. God damn it. What will I build next? I don't know. I do know, actually. It's right in there. But if you want to find out, hit that subscribe button and follow along. Be sure to like and share and all that other stuff, and I'll see you next time.